Okay, I'm consenting. That's my consent. Okay. Hello, everyone. Hi, Greg. This is an event organized by the Society for Systematic Philosophy. Let me first explain what we would like to do here. We would like to have a series of philosophical conversations with systematic philosophers around the world and upload those videos to our website. These videos can be about these philosophers' works, can involve discussions of their books or papers, or they can be about a specific philosophical problem or topic. The format is quite flexible, and the purpose is to make meaningful contributions to systematic philosophy, which includes coming to a better understanding of Hegel's system of philosophy through dialogue and conversation. And we wanted to start with a discussion of Greg's latest book, Hegel's Foundation-Free Metaphysics, Logic of Singularity. And Greg Moss is currently an assistant professor of philosophy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. We know each other from the University of Georgia, where we both received our PhDs. We both worked on Hegel's philosophy on different parts of his system. Greg, I would like to say welcome. And would you like to say a few words about yourself before we do this interview about your book?
Yeah, so thank you, Emre, for organizing the interview, and it's great to talk with you today. I hope this is the first of many conversations that we can have with philosophers throughout the world on systematic philosophy. I don't have much more to say about myself. I think Emre mostly said it all. So I'm an assistant professor at Chinese University of Hong Kong. I study with Richard Winfield, just like Emre at the University of Georgia. I've been here since 2016. So I'm coming up on my 6th year here in Hong Kong. And yeah, why don't we go ahead and jump in?
Okay, let's do that. Let's begin with the title. We talk a lot about Hegel's foundation-free philosophy, but your title doesn't say Hegel's foundation-free philosophy, but Hegel's foundation-free metaphysics. What do you think foundation-free metaphysics is, and why do you think, if you think so, it is a good thing? And there's also this debate over whether Hegel does metaphysics or not. Does that mean that your book takes a stance in this debate?
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot for the question. And it's an important question because it clarifies the title of the book, and then it gives some sense of what we can expect to find in the book. So I want to begin by just reading a quote from the Science of Logic here. So Hegel says that being itself and the special subcategories of it which follow, as well as those of logic in general, may be looked upon as definitions of the absolute or metaphysical definitions of God. So the first thing I just want to say is that the categories of the logic in general may be viewed as metaphysical definitions of God. And other places, Hegel is clear that the goal of philosophy is to be actual knowledge of what truly is. So I think if you read Hegel's text, it's very obvious on his own terms that it's a metaphysics. It's a science of God. It's a science of the absolute. It's a science of what is. The question really is only how. How are we to conceive of metaphysics? And in particular, in a way that is not dogmatic. So that's the question, is what kind of metaphysician is Hegel? And of course, my answer is that he's a foundation-free metaphysician. And that's, of course, in the spirit of Richard Winfield's foundation-free philosophy. I want to go ahead and say from the beginning, though, that when you read Richard Dean Winfield's works and his colleagues like Bill Maker and others, they don't usually talk about the foundation-free metaphysics, right? So already you might think this is a deviation from kind of the Winfieldian paradigm from the beginning. But I think it's not an abandonment, but rather an extension of it. So that's what I want to talk about. I'll talk about this. Why foundation-free metaphysics really is an extension of the ideas that he advocates. And I also think that my development of these ideas can actually respond or help the foundation-free school respond to some of the critiques that have been leveled against against them. But I just want to maybe, there's a lot to say. The book is very long, so I'll try to keep it simple. I've already probably spoken too long about this. But one of the big problems in metaphysics is why is there something? Why is there something and not nothing? And traditionally, this is a question which is thought to be unanswerable, basically. And when we ask why is there something, we're also asking why is there something in contrast to something else, to something other. So whenever we ask about something, we're asking about why is there difference? Why are there differentiations? That's engendered by the question, why is there something? Why are there differences? So we ought to be able somehow to say something about why there are differences at all. Can we even account for why there are differences between things? And I think that actually the traditional understanding of what concepts are, philosophers have struggled to actually answer that question. So on this traditional model of what concepts are principles of identity that specify common features that particulars have in respect to one another, like the concept of mammal that tells you what all mammals have in common, but doesn't differentiate the different kinds of mammals from one another. Now, when you think about concepts on this general model as principles of unity, but not as principles of difference amongst the particulars that fall under them, you end up having to advocate for some kind of foundationalism about concepts. And what I mean by that is, when you think about the domain of concepts on the whole, the domain of concepts on the whole, in which all concepts exist, on this view of concepts, the concept of the concept can only tell you what all concepts have in common, but can't tell you what differentiates concepts from one another. So then the question is, where do the differences between concepts come from? They can't come from the concept of the concept. They would have to come from something outside of the class of concepts. That have to be some kind of non-conceptual content that is introduced in order to differentiate the concepts from one another. And usually that's some kind of psychologistic or naturalistic principle that is introduced from the outside, that's given in advance, that the philosopher has to appeal to in order to differentiate the category of concepts per se. So when we have this kind of foundationalist perspective on concepts, where to differentiate concepts, we have to appeal to some foundation, that is to say, some given content beyond thinking by which we differentiate our thoughts. When we apply that at the grandest scale, the most all-encompassing scale, we'll call it the absolute scale, where what we're considering is not just some universals in contrast to others, but universality that is unconditioned, that is all-encompassing, we come to a paradox which I've called, or a problem that I've called the problem of nihilism, that you can see working itself out in the history of German idealism. And it's kind of a simple problem. It can be articulated quite simply, and this will bring me to what foundation-free metaphysics is. And it's that if you apply this general model of concepts, where concepts are only principles of identity amongst the particulars, some kind of common feature, then if you think about this at the most universal level, we end up with a situation where, for example, we have an all-encompassing concept like being, which can explain what every being has in common, each being is, but won't differentiate any of the beings from each other. So then the question comes, where do the differences come from? Why is there something at all and not nothing? And of course, the highest category, being, won't tell you. It's just a principle of unity. So where does the principle of difference come from? You can't appeal to any difference within the highest genus or the highest class, because that's what you want to explain. Now, if you look outside of the absolute, outside of the totality, you won't find anything. And so we have this problem of, first, the missing difference, the principle by which things are differentiated disappears. And so basically, you just can't account for why there are differences. You can't account for why anything is. So if you have this basic understanding of concepts as principles of universality, not of principles of differentiation amongst the particulars that fall within them, and you apply that at the most general level, what happens is all differences disappear. And of course, this is a false result because there are differences. There are distinctions, right? So we need to rethink what concepts are in order that we can account for the differentiations that are. And I think that's what Hegel does. That's what Hegel does in, I think, the science of logic, is he actually explains why there is something at all. This doesn't have to be a natural something or spiritual something. He's at least accounting for the logical something, the very fact of logical determinacy itself, right? And so he has to rethink concepts as self-differentiating, self-particularizing. And by rethinking concepts as self-particularizing, right, he's no longer forced to appeal to something outside of the highest genus in order to account for why there are differences. So I think the foundation-free metaphysics is basically a way of talking about how it is that Hegel means to answer this question, why is there something rather than nothing? It demands rethinking concepts in order that we can actually answer the question. And I just want to read one of my favorite quotes from The Science of Logic, where he basically expresses this problem and then says that he's going to answer it. He says, the essence of philosophy has often been located by those already adept in the things of thought in the task of answering the question, how does the infinite go forth out of itself and come to finitude? How does the absolute go forth from itself and come to relativity? This, as opinion would have it, escapes conceptual comprehension for the reasons that I just mentioned. In the course of this exposition, the infinite as whose concept we have arrived will further determine itself, and the desideratum, how the infinite, if one can so express oneself, comes to finitude, will be manifested in it in the full manifold of forms. So I think Hegel is a metaphysician in the strongest sense of the term. In the strongest sense you could attribute to Hegel, he is a metaphysician. So that really, so I'm kind of very much taking a position in the debate.
Yeah, I mean, you already said a lot of things about the concept, Hegel's concept of the concept, which looks like, as far as I can understand, sits at the center of your book.
Yeah,
I would say, but still, I want to take a step back and again ask something about the absolute, because this in the book you say that it's a defense of the absolute, and a couple of minutes ago you said here, I mean, Hegel is also giving a metaphysical definition of God, which I take you to mean that it's a definition of the absolute, right? But can you be more specific about the way you defend the absolute, or why it needs a defense? I mean, not just why Hegel is doing in metaphysics, but why you need to defend the absolute.
Yes, okay. That's a great question, because the book begins, the introduction begins, because I have the book here with me.
And by the way, I mean,
Yeah.
it needs to be clarified, I assume, what you mean by absolute, because some people think of absolute as the absolute knowledge. On the other hand, you can think of absolute existence.
Yeah.
I mean, do you mean either one or both or neither?
Yeah, so by absolute, first, the way that I conceive of it is not only that which is universal, but that which is unconditionally universal. So I tend to think of the absolute as that which is universal but unconditionally universal. So that upon which all conditioned universality depends. And in this way, it would be all-inclusive and all-encompassing. Now, this means for me that it would also be, because it's all-inclusive and all-encompassing, has to include within it all existence, but not only that, all knowing of existence too. That's why at the end of the book, when I talk about the philosophy as a knowing of the absolute, this is the absolute's knowing of itself. Or the absolute couldn't be absolutely absolute if it existed outside of knowledge. This is the very last chapter that of the book. So it can only be absolutely absolute if it is known to be absolute, if it's not conditioned by a knowing that stands outside of it. So the unconditioned universal is all-encompassing, and therefore it can't have being and knowing lying outside of it. And so this is one of the themes of the book, is that knowing and being are always accompanying one another in Hegel's understanding. And that, of course, is a very traditional understanding of metaphysics and epistemology, is that they're not so easily separable from each other. Now, why does the absolute need a defense? I think the absolute needs a defense because there are living philosophers arguing that it doesn't exist. So and I have a whole chapter on this in the book. It's this chapter called Relative Dialethism. And basically, this is Marcus Gabriel's position. And he argues that the world doesn't exist. Translated into Hegel's terminology and into my own, this is tantamount to saying that the absolute does not exist. And so, I think Marcus Gabriel's arguments are actually, they give us a great opportunity to rethink Hegel's philosophy with an eye to these metaphysical problems that I was talking about at the beginning. I'll just briefly give you one of the arguments that is given in Gabriel's fields of sense. There's a lot of detail that I can't go through. I don't want to go through all his terminology, right? You can read the book. Listeners can find the book and read it. But just to give maybe one general kind of trajectory of Gabriel's argument, and then where I think Hegel can respond to the argument successfully. So Gabriel makes the point that being is not a being. And when somebody says being is not a being, this seems to be well grounded by the fact that when you're thinking about the unconditioned universal, like being, for example, being doesn't differentiate any being from any other one. So you have this, one could say, indeterminacy of content. Is doesn't differentiate X from Y. So being is not a being, but dialectically that means that being stands in contrast to beings. Being is not a being, and that makes it other to beings, right? Things that are beings. So then you end up making being into a being exactly because you've said that it isn't one. And so the problem then is that being turns out to be a being. Now, if being is a being, it can't be that which all beings have in common, according to Marcus Gabriel. It has to be one of the beings among others. And then you find yourself in a kind of third man regress, right? Where now being is a being, it's a particular. The particular is not the universal that all particulars have in common. And so now you need to posit another being of all beings, right? And this leads to an infinite regress that never ends. In other words, you just never find the being of all beings. You never find the unconditioned universal. You only find conditioned and relative universals. Now, actually, that argument is quite straightforward and quite convincing if you assume from the beginning that the universal cannot itself be particular. If you assume a separation between the principles of universality and particularity, and that's exactly what Hegel argues against in The Science of Logic. And I probably shouldn't say argue. I have to talk about that later. Exactly the point that I think Hegel, he'll account for that difference, but he wants to overcome it as well. So the universal is this self-particularizing agency. It's able to both be the whole and an element of the whole. This is one of the ways Hegel describes it in the Lehre vom Begriff, right? It's the whole and an element of the whole. And that's exactly what Gabriel doesn't allow. But he doesn't really, that's the kind of contemporary context of this book. So what I want to do is both explicate Hegel on his own terms, right? Because that matters, and the problems that bothered him and that he's responding to, while at the same time trying to show the relevance of Hegel's logic for and his philosophy on the whole for contemporary problems and arguments. I hope that makes a little sense.
Yeah.
The Gabriel's a lot more complex, but I just gave a simplified version of it.
Yeah. And according to, I mean, that version sounds a lot like the very dialectic of the concept itself, as you have already said.
Exactly.
I mean, do you think it makes any difference to speak in terms of the universal and the particular instead of being? I mean, because it's Hegel's very account of the universal and the particular.
Yeah, so that's all Gabriel's language, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's the thing is that, I mean, in the end, after you've gone through the logic, you come to see that all of the categories are concepts, right? They all turn out to be concepts, right? And so conceptuality ought to apply to them all. Even if early on in the science of logic, conceptuality as such isn't explicitly appearing. So there is a finesse that's involved, right? The logic of the concept has its own logical form in distinction from, say, the forms of ideality and logic of being and essence, right? And there are different forms of ideality, arguably, right, in the science of logic. But on the other hand, there is this retroactive application of the concept to all of the determinations. That doesn't yet happen at the stage of the concept per se. That actually has to happen later on in the development of the science of logic. But nonetheless, the development of the logic is a Rückgang, right? It's a going back into the origin by which the differentiations are posited. So anyway, this is maybe a subtlety that maybe it's kind of a little early to be jumping into that, but just as a point of clarification that there is this difference between the logic of being and the logic of the concept. But retroactively, these categories of being in essence turn out to be concepts too. Differentiations of the concept themselves. So.
And before I forget, you also said something like Hegel's argument, but in your book, you also point out that Hegel's way to truth is not exactly argumentation. I mean, we all took introduction to philosophy courses, and we always emphasize this importance of argumentation. So philosophy is not just conclusions. I mean, we need to be able to appreciate what an argument is. So what do you mean by this? I mean,
so this is something that I stumbled upon and decided that it's kind of fun to talk about, because in a way, it's like you said, my claims that basically Hegel's dialectic doesn't really involve arguments at all runs against our whole training. I think that's true, and that's actually why it's so hard to learn how to read Hegel and to think with Hegel. So much of the literature just talks about him. We talk about what Hegel said using deductive, inductive arguments, et cetera, but we don't really dialectically think with Hegel. And then when we do, we're often accused of obscurantism, although it is very hard to think with Hegel in your own words. But so I'll just give a few reasons why I think Hegel's dialectical development in the logic and elsewhere is not an argument. First, Hegel's logic is without presupposition, and all arguments involve presuppositions. It's very simple. All arguments involve premises, and the science of logic has no premise. If it has a premise, it has a presupposition. And it has no presupposition, so it has no premises. And what you see is the premises are, in a good argument, are different from the conclusion. The premises justify the conclusion. But what we don't have is a process of self-justification, which is exactly what we need in Hegel's foundation-free epistemology, right? I also say that when we think about argumentation, we think about one way to not think about Hegel is to think about Hegel's logic as giving us a set of formal rules of inference that are separable from the content about which we argue. And because what this does is it introduces, of course, this difference between the form and the content of thinking, the universal form of thought, and the particular thoughts that we apply the universal form to. And of course, because Hegel's logic is undermining, again, this difference between form and content, that's in a way what makes Hegel's logic special, is that the universal particularizes itself, differentiates itself. We can't think about Hegel's logic in terms of a formal set of say, rules of inference and entailment that are applied to an indifferent set of contents. And then Hegel himself says, it's very interesting in the Phenomenology, I think it's the preface, that we don't make arguments anymore. But he does point out that it's not arbitrary. What we're doing is not going to be arbitrary, right? There's got to be a necessary development. And this necessary development is going to proceed differently than by means of arguments. One of the important points here is that he often talks about the vanity of the argument. The need to make an argument indicates that the concepts aren't doing the work on their own, but you're doing the work for them. But things should be the exact opposite, right? The concepts should be doing all the work, and you should be following where they're going, right? So you cease to think for the thought, and thought thinks for you. Now, this is very hard for people. One has to give up on oneself, the vanity of one's ego, and allow thought to think itself. This is, in a way, the burden is off of us to make the arguments. And this is the great liberation. But in another way, it's the great difficulty to follow the developments wherever they may go. Now, what is this method? Well, that's the absolute idea, right? If you want to know what is the method, if it's not argumentation, of course, you have to read the whole science of logic. And so that's obviously very difficult. And one can't give a little, 30-second summary, but I just want to say one thing. One thing that we can say is something like this. If you ask, what is the concept, for example, I'll just take this, take the concept as an example. Hegel's method is, the way that I've described it, it involves the acts of self-referential predication and existential implication. And this basically means something like this. When you ask, what is the concept? You see that, and you answer, the concept is such and such. To say what the concept is, you have to say the concept is such and such. And what you do is you end up having, specifying what the concept is, you have to apply the concept to itself. Now, when you do that, you end up making the concept itself into a particular concept. You're distinguishing what distinguishes the concept from other kinds of concepts like number, quality, etc. And so if the concept itself is conceptual, it has its own conceptual content, then it would stand in contrast to other concepts. So the concept of the concept is that which all concepts have in common, but because it itself is conceptual, it is a particular concept amongst others. So it's universal and particular. And for Hegel, the unity of universality and particularity is what he calls singularity or Einzelheit. So the concept, in virtue of its self-referential predication, implies its own existence as a particular, right? And thereby is sufficient as a principle of truth. The concept alone is sufficient to instantiate itself. The concept alone is sufficient to realize its own truth. And this is a radically different way of thinking about what concepts can and can't do than what we have in the tradition. So this is just kind of a way of indicating at the outset how we might begin to rethink what method looks like. It involves this self-predicative dimension of the concept that results in the concept implying its own existence. And this is really connected to Hegel's notion of absolute truth, a truth that is true in virtue of itself rather than true in virtue of something else, which is how we've traditionally thought about concepts. So yeah, there are no arguments except maybe in the preface or in the remarks, which are often more accessible and that kind of thing. This is also why it's so hard for us, because we're all trained
Yeah,
the wrong way. We're all trained the
or
wrong way.
at least,
Yeah.
yeah, or at least maybe we could say that arguments in the traditional sense are not really there. I
Yeah.
mean, maybe the entire system is itself an argument,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Exactly. In a totally
none of,
different sense, though.
yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. Yeah. So uh, Hegel also speaks of other people using the concept, but he also says they really don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So just like an argument, maybe by concept he means something else, and already, I mean, you've talked about it. Um, Self-predication is something that distinguishes his concept from others. That also you also frequently speak in terms of self-differentiation. Maybe would you like to talk more about it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Is there
Yeah.
any difference between the two, or is there any difference between it's being self-predicating or self-differentiating and existentially implicating? That might sound a little bit different from the other two, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think self-differentiation is more precise. And even better, self-particularization, even more precise than that, right? I use this term self-predication. I'm invoking terms of judgment, arguably, or something like this, which is arguably not justified at the level of the concept per se. But I also do it for the sake of clarifying in language more familiar to readers, for example, how to think about the the developments in the system. And sometimes I'll do that, like when I'm talking about concepts realizing their own existence or being sufficient for their sufficient principles for their own existence. The more precise way is to talk about objectivity. Rather than existence per se, right? But sometimes I'll use more conventional philosophical language to communicate a point, which then has to be clarified in the book as we go along, so as to avoid confusion, right? Um, but yeah, so maybe I'll just talk about the briefly. So I've already mentioned that philosophers have conceived of many different kinds of concepts in the history. And generally, I think Hegel considers three different kinds of three different conceptions of the concept um, that philosophers have taken to be definitive understandings of what concepts are. One is the genus, the other is the abstraction, and the other is the class. And generally, whether we think of the concept as genus, abstraction, or class, all three of these understandings of the concept assume that the universal is not sufficient for the differentiation of the particulars. And generally, I think we can see that this principle follows from the principle of non-contradiction. So if we take a formal view of concepts that thinks of the principle of non-contradiction as a fundamental principle of logical determinacy, the fact that concepts are not contradictory or that they're consistent doesn't specify what the content of the concept is that is self-consistent. And then in order to figure out what that content is, you have to appeal to some other content outside of the form of consistent universality, and you have to introduce that into the empty form. In the book, I don't